The oscilloscope screen flickered once, twice, then died completely. Corporal Hamish Sinclair stared at the black void where green radar sweeps should have been painting enemy aircraft positions across the Solomon Islands. It was November 23, 1942, and the Japanese were launching another massive air raid toward Henderson Field. Without functioning radar, the Allied pilots would be flying blind into an ambush that could cost hundreds of lives and possibly lose Guadalcanal itself. The manual said to replace the burned-out magnetron tube with an exact specifications match, but Sinclair had no replacement magnetron tubes. What he had was a box of salvaged radio parts from a downed bomber, a collection of components that technically violated every regulation in the Royal New Zealand Air Force Maintenance Handbook. His commanding officer had been clear about protocol. His training had been absolute about proper procedures. But as the distant rumble of approaching Japanese engines grew louder, Sinclair made a choice that would either court-martial him or save the entire Pacific campaign. He reached for the wrong parts. No one in the 14th Fighter Squadron knew that one New Zealand farm boy's mechanical heresy that morning would rewrite the rules of radar maintenance forever. Hamish Sinclair had grown up in the rolling hills outside Invercargill, where his father ran a sheep station and his mother taught at the local school. Born in 1921, he spent his childhood dismantling farm equipment, not to destroy it, but to understand how pistons moved and gears meshed, and why some engines purred while others knocked. His father, Angus Sinclair, had fought in the Great War and returned with shrapnel in his leg, and an appreciation for men who could fix things under pressure. When young Hamish took apart the family radio at age 12 and rebuilt it with better reception than the factory original, Angus knew his son possessed something beyond normal mechanical aptitude. The boy could see inside machines, visualize their purposes, and improve their function through pure instinct. Hamish completed his technical education at Otago University, studying electrical engineering while working nights at a radio repair shop in Dunedin. His professors noted his unconventional approach to problem-solving. Where other students followed established procedures, Sinclair experimented with cross-applications, using valve designs from one field to solve problems in another. His thesis on electromagnetic resonance frequency modification earned distinction, but his real education came from fixing radios that other technicians had declared hopeless. He discovered that sometimes the best solution came not from having the right parts, but from making the available parts behave correctly. When war erupted across the Pacific, Sinclair enlisted immediately, driven by duty and a desire to put his skills towards stopping fascism. Basic training revealed his exceptional technical abilities, and he was fast-tracked into radar maintenance school in Australia. There, instructors taught rigid adherence to specifications, exact part replacements, and by-the-book troubleshooting procedures. Sinclair excelled academically, but chafed against the inflexibility. He understood that battlefield conditions might demand improvisation, but his superiors emphasized that radar equipment was too sophisticated for field modifications. Any deviation from approved procedures could compromise the entire early warning network that protected Allied airfields from surprise attack. He graduated near the top of his class and was assigned to Henderson Field, where American Marines and Allied airmen were fighting desperately to hold their small foothold in the Solomon Islands. None of his instructors had prepared him for the reality that replacement parts might be weeks away, while enemy bombers approached in minutes. The battle for Guadalcanal represented the first major Allied offensive against Japanese forces in the Pacific theater. Since August 7, 1942, American Marines had been clinging to a narrow perimeter around Henderson Field, the strategic airstrip that could determine control of the entire Solomon Islands chain. The Japanese Imperial Navy commanded the surrounding waters at night, bringing reinforcements and supplies down what Marines called the Tokyo Express. But during daylight hours, Allied aircraft based at Henderson Field could attack Japanese positions and supply lines, slowly bleeding the enemy forces. The entire campaign balanced on a knife's edge. Each side understood that losing Henderson Field meant losing the Solomon Islands, which would either open Australia to invasion or force Japan to abandon their southern defensive perimeter. Radar technology had become the crucial force multiplier that allowed outnumbered Allied pilots to intercept incoming Japanese raids before they could destroy the airfield. The early warning provided by coastal radar stations gave fighter pilots precious minutes to climb to altitude and position themselves for attack. Without radar, Japanese bombers could approach undetected and devastate Henderson Field, grounding Allied aircraft and allowing Japanese forces to overrun the Marine positions. Intelligence reports indicated that Japanese commanders were planning increasingly massive air raids designed to permanently disable Henderson Field's operational capacity. These raids involved hundreds of aircraft, approaching from multiple directions, timed to overwhelm defensive capabilities. Allied pilots were already flying multiple sorties daily, pushing both men and machines beyond normal endurance limits. The mathematics were stark. Lose radar capability for even one major raid, and the entire Guadalcanal campaign could collapse within hours. Maintenance crews worked around the clock to keep radar equipment functional, but jungle humidity, tropical heat, and constant vibration from artillery bombardments created a hostile environment for delicate electronic equipment. Replacement parts arrived irregularly, often damaged by the long Pacific crossing or destroyed during Japanese night attacks on supply ships. Radar technicians had standing orders to maintain equipment according to strict specifications, using only approved replacement components to ensure consistent performance across the early warning network. These procedures had been developed by the finest engineers in America and Britain, tested under laboratory conditions, and proven effective in European theaters of operation. But the Pacific War presented unique challenges that laboratory testing could not anticipate. The morning of November 23rd began with reports of massive Japanese air formations assembling at bases throughout the northern Solomon Islands. Intelligence intercepts suggested this would be the largest air raid yet attempted against Henderson Field, with over 200 bombers and fighters participating in a coordinated assault designed to eliminate Allied air power permanently. Radar stations along the coast reported normal operations during the pre-dawn hours, tracking routine Japanese reconnaissance flights and several small harassment raids. But as the sun climbed higher, more radar stations began experiencing equipment failures. The combination of overnight humidity, intense morning heat, and vibration from a pre-dawn artillery exchange had created a cascade of technical problems across the early warning network. Station after station reported degraded performance or complete equipment failure, leaving dangerous gaps in radar coverage. Sinclair received urgent calls from 3 different radar installations, all requesting immediate technical support for critical component failures. The first station had suffered a complete magnetron tube failure, rendering their primary radar inoperative. The second reported intermittent signal processing problems that made target tracking impossible. The third station had lost all display capabilities, meaning operators could receive radar returns, but could not visualize target positions or vectors. Standard procedure required Sinclair to prioritize repairs based on strategic importance, but all 3 stations guarded crucial approach corridors toward Henderson Field. Losing any of them would create a blind spot that Japanese raiders could exploit. Sinclair's supply inventory revealed the scope of the crisis. He had exactly 0 replacement magnetron tubes, 2 questionable signal processing units that had already failed once, and 1 display system that required components currently aboard a supply ship somewhere between Australia and Guadalcanal. His maintenance manual provided clear guidance. Equipment with failed components should be tagged as inoperative until proper replacement parts arrived. No field modifications were authorized. No component substitutions were approved. Any deviation from approved procedures would result in court-martial charges for endangering Allied personnel through equipment tampering. But as radio reports described Japanese formations growing larger and approaching closer, Sinclair realized that following procedures would guarantee the exact catastrophe those procedures were designed to prevent. He had spent his childhood making tractors run with wrong-sized pistons and radios work with mismatched tubes. Every instinct told him that machines cared more about function than specifications, more about purpose than paperwork. The question was whether he trusted his instincts more than he feared military justice. The first station's magnetron tube failure seemed hopeless, until Sinclair examined the salvage box he had assembled from crashed aircraft and damaged equipment. Among the collection of seemingly useless parts, he found a radio transmitter tube from a downed American bomber. The tube was larger than the specified magnetron, operated at a different frequency, and had been designed for an entirely different purpose. According to every technical manual, attempting to use this tube in a radar transmitter would either fail completely or damage the entire system beyond repair. But Sinclair could see past the obvious differences to the underlying electromagnetic principles. Both tubes generated high-frequency electromagnetic radiation. Both controlled that radiation through magnetic field manipulation. The bomber tube actually operated at higher power levels than the radar specification required, meaning it could theoretically provide stronger signal output if properly adapted. The challenge lay in modification. The tube's physical dimensions differed significantly, requiring custom mounting brackets fabricated from scrap metal. The electrical connections operated at different voltages and impedances, demanding careful circuit modifications to prevent component damage. Most critically, the frequency differences meant that the entire radar system would need recalibration to accommodate the new operating parameters. Any mistake in these modifications could destroy not only the improvised tube, but potentially the entire radar transmitter, leaving the station permanently inoperative. Sinclair spent 47 minutes machining new mounting hardware from aluminum salvage, rewiring connection points with copper liberated from damaged radio equipment, and calculating the electrical modifications needed to integrate the bomber tube into the radar system. His hands moved with practiced confidence, but his mind wrestled with the implications of what he was attempting. If the modification succeeded, he would prove that approved procedures were unnecessarily restrictive, potentially opening every radar technician to charges of failing to improvise when proper parts were unavailable. If the modification failed catastrophically, he would face court-martial for destroying critical equipment during active combat operations. As he installed the final connections, Japanese aircraft engines became audible in the distance. The morning's massive raid was approaching Henderson Field, and the Allied early warning network remained critically compromised. Sinclair activated the modified radar transmitter, watched the improvised magnetron tube begin generating electromagnetic pulses, and held his breath as the display screen flickered to life. The first radar sweep painted a perfect picture of incoming Japanese formations, clearly defining aircraft positions, headings, and estimated speeds. The wrong tube was working better than the original equipment. The second radar station presented a different challenge that required even more creative interpretation of approved procedures. The signal processing unit had developed an intermittent failure that caused target returns to fade randomly, making accurate tracking impossible. Sinclair's diagnostic testing revealed that moisture infiltration had corroded several circuit board connections, creating electrical resistance that varied with humidity and temperature changes. The approved repair procedure required replacing the entire signal processing unit with an identical component from authorized inventory. But Sinclair had no replacement signal processing units, and the corroded connections seemed amenable to a more direct solution. He had noticed that radio equipment from different aircraft manufacturers often used similar circuit board designs with different component layouts. A damaged communication radio from a crashed fighter aircraft contained circuit boards with identical basic construction to the radar signal processor, but arranged in different configurations and operating at different frequencies. Sinclair realized that he could potentially harvest clean circuit board sections from the radio and graft them onto the radar processor, replacing the corroded areas with fresh connections. This approach violated multiple maintenance regulations simultaneously. It involved cannibalizing parts from non-radar equipment, creating hybrid circuits that had never been tested together, and modifying sealed units that were supposed to be replaced entirely when defective. But as Japanese aircraft formations continued approaching Henderson Field, Sinclair began the delicate process of circuit board surgery. Using tools improvised from medical instruments and watchmakers' equipment, he carefully removed clean circuit sections from the radio and prepared them for integration into the radar processor. Each connection required precise soldering work to maintain proper electrical continuity while avoiding short circuits that could destroy both components. The work demanded steady hands and perfect concentration, while artillery shells exploded in the distance, and radio reports described Japanese formations growing closer every minute. After 38 minutes of microscopic electrical work, Sinclair had successfully grafted clean circuit sections onto the radar signal processor, bypassing all corroded connections with fresh electrical pathways. The hybrid circuit board looked like nothing in any technical manual, but it functioned perfectly, providing clear and consistent target tracking with no signal fading or intermittent failures. The second radar station resumed full operational capability just as Japanese bombers crossed the outer detection perimeter. The third station's display failure required the most audacious improvisation yet. The cathode ray tube that generated the visual radar display had suffered complete failure, leaving operators unable to see radar returns, even though the system was receiving and processing target information correctly. Standard procedure demanded replacing the entire display unit, but Sinclair had no replacement displays available. However, his salvage collection included a television picture tube from a crashed transport aircraft, originally intended for recreational use at a base recreation facility. Television tubes and radar display tubes operated on similar principles, both using electron beams to create phosphorescent images on treated screens. The television tube was actually larger and capable of higher resolution than the radar display specification required. But television tubes were designed for entertainment broadcasting, not military radar applications, and no technical documentation existed for adapting television equipment to radar use. Sinclair would have to reverse engineer the entire integration process, determining the electrical modifications needed to make a television tube display radar information accurately. The challenge involved matching electrical signals, adapting control circuits, and calibrating display parameters without any manufacturer guidance or testing protocols. Additionally, the television tube's physical dimensions required fabricating a completely new mounting system and modifying the radar console to accommodate the larger display. As Japanese aircraft engines grew louder overhead, Sinclair worked frantically to complete the television tube integration. He rewired display control circuits, fabricated mounting brackets from spare aluminum, and calibrated the television tube to respond correctly to radar signal inputs. The improvised display system activated just as the first Japanese bombers appeared on the horizon, painting their positions with crystal clarity on a television screen that was now serving as a military radar display. All three radar stations were operational again, providing complete coverage of Japanese approach routes with equipment that violated every maintenance regulation in the military handbook. Allied fighters launched from Henderson Field with full radar guidance, intercepting the Japanese formation while it was still miles from the target. The battle that followed demonstrated the crucial importance of early warning radar, as Allied pilots used advanced positioning information to achieve devastating surprise attacks against the incoming raiders. Of the 217 Japanese aircraft that began the mission, only 73 returned to their bases, and Henderson Field suffered minimal damage. Intelligence reports later revealed that Japanese commanders had planned this raid as the final knockout blow that would eliminate Allied air power in the Solomon Islands. Instead, the massive losses convinced Japanese leadership that continued attacks against Henderson Field were unsustainable, leading to their eventual withdrawal from Guadalcanal. The immediate aftermath of Sinclair's unauthorized modifications created a complex situation for military leadership. On one hand, his violations of maintenance procedures were clear and unambiguous, warranting disciplinary action according to established regulations. On the other hand, his improvised repairs had directly contributed to a decisive Allied victory that potentially saved the entire Guadalcanal campaign. Colonel Harrison Mackenzie, the commanding officer responsible for radar operations in the Solomon Islands, faced an unprecedented dilemma. Court-martialing Sinclair for equipment tampering would send a clear message about the importance of following approved procedures, but it would also punish initiative and problem-solving skills that had proven invaluable under combat conditions. After consulting with higher command authorities, Mackenzie decided to conduct a thorough investigation of Sinclair's modifications to determine whether they represented dangerous improvisation or legitimate innovation that should be incorporated into official maintenance procedures. A team of radar engineers from Australia and the United States arrived at Henderson Field to examine Sinclair's work and evaluate its implications for future maintenance operations. What they discovered surprised everyone involved in the investigation. Sinclair's bomber tube modification had actually improved radar performance significantly, providing stronger signal strength and better target resolution than the original magnetron design. His circuit board grafting technique had created more reliable connections than the factory originals, with superior resistance to humidity and corrosion. Most remarkably, his television tube adaptation had produced a display system with better clarity and larger viewing area than the standard radar displays being manufactured in the United States. The investigating engineers recommended that all three modifications be studied for potential incorporation into official maintenance procedures and equipment specifications. Rather than being court-martialed for equipment tampering, Sinclair found himself being interviewed by design engineers who wanted to understand his problem-solving methodology and learn from his innovative approaches to technical challenges. His superiors quietly expunged any record of procedural violations and instead submitted detailed reports describing his contributions to Allied victory in the Solomon Islands. Sinclair's post-war life reflected the modest character that had made his wartime achievements possible. He returned to New Zealand in 1946, married his childhood sweetheart Margaret Dalrymple, and established a radio repair shop in Invercargill that became known throughout the South Island for solving impossible technical problems. Customers brought him equipment that other technicians had declared hopeless, knowing that Sinclair possessed an almost mystical ability to make broken things work again. He never advertised his wartime service or mentioned his role in the Guadalcanal campaign, preferring to let his work speak for itself. Local farmers and shopkeepers knew him simply as the man who could fix anything, unaware that his improvised repairs had once helped save the Pacific theater of operations. Margaret understood the significance of her husband's wartime contributions, but she also respected his desire for privacy and never discussed his service with their neighbors. The couple raised 3 children who inherited their father's mechanical aptitude and their mother's practical wisdom. Sinclair taught his sons and daughter to see past obvious problems to underlying solutions, to trust their instincts when conventional approaches failed, and to remember that machines were built to serve human purposes rather than bureaucratic procedures. Letters arrived occasionally from fellow veterans who remembered the morning when radar coverage had returned just in time to guide Allied fighters against the largest Japanese air raid of the Guadalcanal campaign. Some writers understood Sinclair's role in maintaining that radar coverage, while others simply remembered him as the New Zealand technician who always seemed to have the right tools and the right answers when equipment failed. These letters invariably described how Sinclair's work had saved lives, protected missions, and contributed to Allied victory in ways that went far beyond normal maintenance duties. One letter from a former American fighter pilot described how radar guidance had allowed him to intercept a Japanese formation that was preparing to attack a hospital ship evacuating wounded Marines. Another letter from an Australian radar operator explained how Sinclair's circuit board modifications had continued working flawlessly through 2 more years of combat operations, providing reliable service long after the original components would have failed completely. A third letter from a British signals officer noted that Sinclair's television tube adaptation had been studied by engineers in London and incorporated into new radar display designs that were being manufactured for post-war civilian aviation use. The broader implications of Sinclair's wartime innovations extended far beyond individual recognition or personal achievement. Military technicians throughout the Pacific Theater began adopting more flexible approaches to equipment maintenance, recognizing that battlefield conditions often demanded creative solutions that textbooks could not anticipate. The rigid adherence to approved procedures that had characterized early war maintenance operations gradually gave way to a more adaptive philosophy that emphasized achieving mission objectives through whatever means were available and effective. Sinclair's successful modifications proved that skilled technicians could safely adapt equipment to meet operational requirements without compromising reliability or performance. This realization led to changes in technical training programs that began teaching problem-solving methodology alongside standard procedures, preparing maintenance personnel to think creatively when conventional approaches failed. The radar equipment modifications that Sinclair developed during the Guadalcanal campaign influenced post-war electronics design in ways that extended far beyond military applications. His bomber tube adaptation demonstrated that electromagnetic devices could be successfully cross-applied between different systems, leading to more versatile component designs that could serve multiple purposes. His circuit board grafting technique anticipated the modular electronics construction that would become standard in civilian consumer products during the 1950s and 60s. Most significantly, his television tube modification helped bridge the gap between military radar technology and civilian electronics, contributing to the rapid post-war expansion of television broadcasting and electronic communication systems. Engineers who studied Sinclair's work during the war investigation carried his innovative approaches into civilian careers, where they continued developing adaptive solutions to technical challenges. Some became leaders in the emerging television industry, others contributed to early computer development, and several helped establish the aerospace programs that would eventually reach the moon. All of them remembered the lesson that Sinclair had demonstrated under combat conditions, that the best technical solutions often came from seeing past conventional limitations to underlying possibilities. The willingness to use wrong parts for right purposes became a hallmark of the innovative engineering that characterized America's post-war technological leadership. Hamish Sinclair passed away quietly in 1987, surrounded by family and friends who knew him as a devoted husband, father, and community member. His funeral drew hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by his skill, kindness, and willingness to help anyone with a technical problem. The eulogy made brief mention of his wartime service, but focused primarily on his contributions to the Invercargill community and his reputation for mechanical genius. Only a few attendees fully understood that the mild-mannered radio repairman being honored that day had once defied military regulations to save thousands of lives and help secure Allied victory in the Pacific. Among the mourners were several aging veterans who had made special trips to New Zealand to pay their respects to the man whose innovations had protected them during the darkest days of the war. These men understood that courage came in many forms, and that sometimes the most important heroism happened quietly, in technical workshops and radar stations, performed by modest individuals who simply did what needed to be done regardless of regulations or recognition. Margaret Sinclair discovered among her husband's papers a collection of letters and documents that revealed the full scope of his wartime achievements for the first time. Technical reports described his modifications in detailed engineering language that she could not fully understand, but their conclusions were unmistakable. Hamish Sinclair's unauthorized improvisations had contributed directly to Allied victory and had influenced military technology development for decades. More moving were the personal letters from men who had survived, because radar coverage had returned just in time to guide defensive fighters or warn of incoming attacks. These letters expressed gratitude that could never be adequately repaid, recognition that could never be fully conveyed, and respect for a man whose technical genius had been matched by his moral courage. Margaret donated the collection to the New Zealand Military History Museum, where it joined other records documenting the contributions of ordinary individuals who had performed extraordinary service during humanity's greatest crisis. The story of Hamish Sinclair's unauthorized radar modifications raises profound questions about the nature of duty, innovation, and moral courage that remain relevant long after the end of the Second World War. His decision to violate maintenance regulations in order to restore radar coverage required him to choose between competing definitions of responsible behavior. Following approved procedures would have demonstrated respect for authority and commitment to establish safety protocols, but it would also have guaranteed mission failure and potential catastrophic losses. Trusting his own judgment and technical skills meant accepting personal responsibility for consequences that could have included court-martial equipment destruction, and operational disaster. The fact that his innovations succeeded brilliantly should not obscure the courage required to make that choice under extreme pressure, with incomplete information and no guarantee of success. Modern technology development continues to wrestle with similar tensions between procedural safety and adaptive innovation. Engineers and technicians working on critical systems must balance the security of established methods against the potential advantages of creative approaches that have not been thoroughly tested. Sinclair's example suggests that the most important technical decisions often cannot be made by consulting manuals or following predetermined procedures, but require human judgment, creativity, and willingness to accept responsibility for unconventional choices. His story also demonstrates that true expertise involves understanding not just how systems are supposed to work, but why they work, enabling adaptive solutions that achieve intended purposes through unexpected means. The radar equipment that Sinclair modified with wrong parts ultimately performed better than the original designs because he understood the underlying principles deeply enough to improve upon approved specifications. This kind of intuitive technical mastery cannot be taught through standard training programs, but must be developed through years of hands-on experience, creative experimentation, and willingness to see past conventional limitations. Perhaps most importantly, Sinclair's wartime service illustrates that heroism often occurs in technical workshops and maintenance facilities rather than in dramatic combat situations, performed by individuals whose names never appear in history books, but whose contributions prove essential to victory. The quiet courage required to trust one's own judgment against established authority, to risk personal consequences for potential mission success, and to accept responsibility for innovative solutions may be more common than we recognize, but it is no less admirable for its ordinary appearance. Would you have broken the order or obeyed it? Would you have trusted proven procedures or risked everything on improvised solutions? Comment below and share this story so others remember what courage really means when regulations conflict with necessity, and following the rules means accepting defeat.